This is my 4.1 assignment about ethical and legal issues. So during World War II, the Nazis would take different people from the concentration camps where they were kept, or those who were prisoners of war. These subjects would then be humanely experimented on. So these experimented included like experiments on twins, head injury experiments, high altitude experiments, seawater experiments. Subjects were put into like freezing temperatures until the experiment was finished, or they consequently died from it. These experiments would go on for hours, and as I just mentioned, other experiments would include high altitude experiments in which the subjects would be put into chambers with little air supply to recreate a high altitude environment. They would then be left to see what impact this would have on their bodies, and however many died from this. So the central leader of these experiments was Joseph Mengele. Mengele was known for experimenting on twins and dwarfs. He did lots of different experiments on the twins, which included giving them several different injections to see how they would react to them. And if one twin died during these experiments, and the other would be murdered by a lethal injection to the heart and then dissected. Their main aim was to see how these prisoners of war reacted to during the different experiments, so that they would have heads up on what would cause maximum damage to people. This experimentation was not only inhumane, but it was also illegal and very unethical. What they were doing is causing physical or mental harm to others, which is not ethical, and which can sometimes lead to death, which would be classed as murder, which is illegal. So these are two significant theories. So first of all, you have Philip Zimbardo, which in 1971 he conducted the Stanford Prison Experiment. This experiment used college students and was used to show the difficulties between guards and offenders in prisons. The participants were told that they would participate in a 2-week prison simulation, but were told nothing else apart from that. The team of people were 24 males who were deemed to be the most stable and healthy people. 12 of the participants were given the role of a guard, and the other 12 were given the role of the prisoners. A day before the experiment was due to start, the guards would be given a briefing and were told they could not use any physical harm or withhold food or drink. On the day of the experiment, the so-called prisoners were arrested at their homes in charge of armed robbery by real policemen, and they were then taken to the station where they would go through the procedures of fingerprinting the mugshots, and they were then blindfolded and taken to the mock prison in the university where they were strip searched and given a new identity. The results of this experiment showed that on the second day the prisoners blockaded their cells and refused to cooperate with any of the guards' instructions, and consequently the guards attacked the prisoners with fire extinguishers without being supervised by the research staff. The guards then set up a privileged cell where those who weren't involved in the riots would get treated with better quality food, and the people who were privileged would get to choose whether they were allowed, whether they were going to eat the meal, and if they didn't eat it, would stay with their fellow prisoners. After 36 hours, one prisoner started suffering from a psychological breakdown, so had to be released. And after 6 days, the experiment had to be called to a halt as the guards were using physical and psychological punishment in order to get the prisoners to do what they were told to do. In conclusion, Zimbardo's results were compatible with those of the Milgram experiment and showed that some guards felt it necessary to show their dominance even when it wasn't necessary. So you then got Milgram's experiment. So Stanley Milgram, 1963, conducted this experiment to see how far people would go in obeying an instruction, even if it involved harming another person. The participants were 40 males, aged between 20 to 50, with a different range of jobs. The participants were then introduced to another participant who was working with Milgram. They then got assigned roles learner or teacher, with the participant working with Milgram always being the learner. So there was also a third person in the who was the experimenter, which was played by an actor. So 2 rooms in the laboratory were used, one for the learner, which was another actor working with Milgram with an electric chair, and the other for the teacher and experimenter with an electric shock generator. The teacher then asked lots of questions, and every time the learner got these wrong, the teacher would then give an electric shock, making them bigger each time. So they had 30 switches from 15 volts, which is slight, to 450 volts, which is dangerous and could kill someone. If a teacher stopped giving the shocks, the experimenter would probe them, basically telling them what they had to do. Milgram found that 65% of the participants continued to the highest level of 450 volts, whilst the rest of the participants continued to 300 volts. He concluded that ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even if it means killing someone. Both of these experiments have shown that there were legal issues with them. In Zimbardo's experiment, many of the prisoners came away with psychological issues and few with physical harm. From Milgram's experiment, we can see that people will cause physical harm to people, even to the point of death, just by someone telling them to do so. This is not ethical, and if it's to the point of death, it's not legal either. The teachers from Milgram's experiment may come back with psychological effects themselves, because they're the ones that have admitted the shocks and basically killed someone. So, for historical perspective, so prior to 1947, there was no accepted code of conduct for human experimentation. You then had the Nuremberg Code, which is 1947, which was the 10 points. You then had the Declaration of Helsinki, which was in 1964, which is the World Medical Association, and then a set of ethical principles was set. So the Nuremberg Code. So the first one was that human subjects should give their consent, and should be told what the subject matter is, and that they understand, and the hazard should also be outlined. The second one was that experiment should be of purpose and not random. Third one, experiment should be designed and based on the results from animal experimentation. Number 4, experiments should avoid unnecessary physical mental injury, so physical harm, mental harm, or any suffering. Number 5, experiments should not go ahead if death or disabling injury are potentially going to occur. Number 6, risk assessments must be carried out. Number 7, preparations to be made, facilities provided to protect the experimental subject from harm. Number 8, the experiment should be conducted by a qualified person and care should be taken. Number 9, during the experiments, the experimental subject can stop the experiment at any point. And number 10, during the experiment, the scientist in charge should be prepared to stop the experiment at any point if they believe that the experiment could result in harm from the subject. So BASES is the British Association of Exercise and Sport and Exercise Science. So BASES produce a code of conduct for sport science practitioners and researchers, and so an outline of ethical and legal issues that need to be considered are so informed consent, which is a legal document. For any research, they must get informed consent permission from their participants before starting the experiment. If the participant is unable to give consent, then their legal attorney can give consent for them. An informed consent explains what the experiment and what is in the experiment, and then what they will have to do during it. As well as informed consent, the participant should also sign a participant disclaimer. The participant disclaimer covers the researcher's back, and it basically says that if you're ill or injured during the experiment due to you, the participant, not following the correct instructions, then you have to take full responsibility for it. Participants also have the right to withdraw from any experiment that they are taking part in. If they're finding it too hard or they're being harmed in any way, then they can stop and leave the experiment. The researcher should also be able to stop the experiment at any point in case anything goes wrong or the participant is ill. All of the participants must be volunteers, so must be formally consenting for themselves to take part without being pressured into doing so by the researcher or anyone else. The researcher must also not use deception, as the volunteers should be told exactly what the experiment will include, and if there are any changes they should be told beforehand, and they still have a right to withdraw. So they also need to consider the risk-benefit analysis, and this is where they weigh up the pros and cons of a certain experiment. For example, they will look at the risk assessment and see if the possible benefits from the experiment will outweigh these risks. If they do not, then the experiment should not go ahead because some kind of risk or harm could come to the participants. As a researcher, they will need to make sure that the participant does a health and medical screening questionnaire. This questionnaire will tell the researchers whether the participant is healthy enough to do the experiment, but it will also tell them if they have any medical conditions such as asthma, so that they will know the procedures of the risk assessment they need to do in preparation. So the research responsibility, so the researcher must protect the participant from any harm before, during and after the study. Handle data with respect and confidentiality, and be competent, ensuring the study is constantly being monitored by someone. Equality and impartiality. The researcher is expected to be objective and neutral when it comes to encouraging participants. They must try hard not to be biased towards an individual. Before a researcher can go ahead with the experiment or prep their volunteers, they have to think about health and safety so that the participant does not suffer from any physical or emotional harm. To do this, the researcher will do a full risk assessment showing all the risks that could happen and how they will prevent these risks. If the risks are too high and the experiment is deemed unsafe, the experiment won't go ahead. Scientific misconduct. So researchers must be very careful when they're carrying out their experiments, as if they misuse any equipment or do something wrong, then it could lead to serious implications for them, depending on the severity of the mistake.